Societies for the third paper of our first session of today. We heard a lot about Portuguese international trade, about adaptation of production for different markets, about silk production, and we're now moving on to draperies and woolen cloth production. I am thrilled to present to you, of course, first our speaker, our third speaker of this morning, Ángel Rozas Español. I'm getting better at it, I think. Who is from the University of, look it up, of Complutense, in Spain anyway. I'm learning a lot of new names from Southern Europe. Works on, many actually topics also beyond textile history. A lot of, I saw that you worked a lot on merchants and their businesses, and on merchants, for example, the Toledo merchants in Castilian fairs. So more of the trade network in which textiles, of course, also move. Also, if I saw correctly, on rural credits, something with credits. Yeah, okay. But of course, I mean, money accumulation is of course also important to textile industries and to economies altogether. But also, of course, on trade, for example, in wool, I think, Spanish papers, so I translated it myself. But today you're here, of course, to talk about textiles, about the central Castilian draperies between the 15th and the 16th centuries. So as I said, we are moving all through the different fabrics between linen and then silk, of course, and now moving on to the draperies of Castilian draperies. So thank you. Looking forward. The floor is yours.
Well, good morning, all. Thank you for your presentation, and also I would like to thank the organizer of this conference for their excellent work and for accepting my paper. It is a pleasure for me and a great opportunity to take part in the discussions that are taking place during these days. Without further ado, the topic of my intervention is central draperies between 15th and 16th centuries. This proposal aims to offer a comprehensive approach of the interactions between urban and rural cloth productions in the center of Castile. Firstly, it will be assumed that Castilian cloth manufacturing was widespread and dynamic, even though many foreign cloths were imported and consumed in the kingdom. Secondly, the study will include the analysis of the cloth production of several cities, but mainly Toledo and Cuenca, and the potential to coordinate the manufacturing activities of other centers. Well, with regard to the historiographical considerations on Castilian cloth manufacturing, I would like to start with one quote from Francesco Guicciardini, the Florentine ambassador in Spain in 1512, who wrote in his work Relazione di Spagna the following: "In some places of Spain, cloths and crimson gold fabrics are weaved, like in Valencia, Toledo, or Sevilla, but the country in general is opposed to industry. The poverty is great, and in my opinion, it is not so much due to the quality of the country as to the nature of its people, opposed to work, who prefer to send to the other countries the first materials that their kingdom produce to buy them afterwards in other forms, as can be seen in the wool and silk that they sell to foreigners to buy their clothes and fabrics from them." These observations have had an impact in the historiographical analysis of Spanish economy. Some relevant historians of the previous century, such as Carlo Cipolla, stated, by quoting this source, that indeed Spanish manufacturing was never developed in the pre-industrial period. However, most of historians that have evaluated the topic from a widened perspective have differentiated the kingdom of the Iberian Peninsula and consulted local sources, and startlingly obtained more cautious conclusions. In short, the Castilian international trade that consisted mainly in wool exportation and cloth importations obscured the local cloth manufacturing, which during the 15th century had a notable development, but it never satisfied by itself the cloth demand of the kingdom. Thus, many studies focus on, or have as their horizon, the struggle for wool between exporters and local producers to understand the weakness of this economic sector. In this respect, Francesco Giucardini's observation has been confirmed in some way, even though historians usually disagree with him about the non-working nature of Spanish people. Certainly, Castilian cloth manufacturing cannot be interpreted without considering this essential fact, but it was not only affected by international trade, as it was shown decades ago by the fundamental work of Paulino Iradiel. This study about Cuenca's cloth manufacturing explained with detail how this activity must be analyzed through the changes in the structure of production and the market demands of the Iberian Peninsula. The studies that followed it delved generally into one of these two aspects. They delved particularly into the structure of production of the different Castilian cities, as the main sources preserved have been local and royal cloth regulations. In the present days, it is relatively known the cloth manufacturing of Castilian cities such as Palencia, Segovia, Madrid, Toledo, Córdoba, Seville, Chinchilla, and Murcia. Nevertheless, much remains to be known. Leaving aside that the almost total lack of knowledge of cloth commercialization and consumption in Castile, two issues have been the most notable for having been relegated from analysis: the changes and continuities of each local manufacturing and the relations between all of them. In the first case, as local and royal cloths ordinances have generally been the main source, transformation have only arisen for certain periods, particularly between 1494 and 1511, when the monarchy developed a great project to homogenize the regulation of cloth production of the entire kingdom. And in it, several Castilian cities participated by writing reports. This absence of varied sources tends to restrain the analysis of transformations of local cloth manufacturing to those studies focused on the 16th century and forward, which, by the way, there are not many. In the second case, all these studies are devoted to the analysis of urban production, and despite the fact that some of them pay attention to a greater or lesser extent to the rural production, few papers address this phenomenon by itself. Furthermore, beyond city-countryside relations, the different local cloth manufacturing have been interpreted isolated. Comparative approaches are far from common. At this point, it is necessary to stress the need to approach the analysis of Castilian cloth manufacturing from these two perspectives. On the one hand, paying special attention to changing trends, and on the other hand, considering them in a comparative way between the different cities. This would be the best approach to make use of sources which are relatively scarce, but which nevertheless point to the interrelation of the different local productions. When considering the price valuation of cloth in Castile made by the monarchs during the Middle Ages, it's possible to observe that the main cloth manufacturing centers changed. In 1253, the most expensive Castilian cloth was produced in Toledo, while a decade later, in 1268, it was produced in Segovia. On the other side, at the beginning of the 15th century, the most valued Castilian clothes were produced in the town of Chillón, while Toledo cloth manufacturing was not mentioned, and Segovia's clothes were not among the most valued. Fiscal sources from the 15th century and forward also point to a great dynamism. For instance, they allow to date in detail how the production of finished clothes in the city of Palencia declined through the 15th century. On the contrary, they show how Segovia's cloth manufacturing started to grow up at the end of the 15th century to become, decades later, the greatest Castilian cloth producer. These sources also facilitate comparative studies, although it is true that they do not always reflect the level of production, but rather the level of consumption of cloth, as is evident in the case of Valladolid, which has a high revenue from cloth, but it is known to have a low manufacturing capacity. Well, after this brief historiographical balance, I would like to contribute to this research area by analyzing and comparing Toledo and Cuenca clothes manufacturing between the 15th and 16th centuries. For this purpose, I will draw on part of the historiography discussed above, especially the work of Paulino Iradiel, who follows in detail the evolution of Cuenca's cloth manufacturing. And as far as Toledo is concerned, I will offer a study of unpublished sources. The analysis will focus on two moments in which the monarchy intervened in the production system. First, the General Cloth Ordinances of 1494, 1511, and later in 1552, when the monarchy became interested in the increase in the prices of clothes that happened in the previous years. Well, with regard to the origins of the two cities, cloth manufacturing, there are important temporal and qualitative differences. Toledo had its first strong development at the end of the 14th century, when its ordinances have been dated. According to this source, production was already very well structured, with a clear division of labor between the different officers. And also, it was oriented towards the market, as the title of these ordinances states. They were for paños mercaderos, that is, cloth for sale. Within all this regulation, a fundamental figure is the Lord of the Cloth, who is the owner and director of the production process. In the case of Cuenca, the city had a similar ordinances around 1421, several decades later than Toledo. The Lord of the Cloth was also a prominent figure in them, but unlike Toledo, the city's craftsmen managed to form guilds, which were endorsed by the city council and controlled local production through their own overseers. This difference was a key factor in the evolution of cloth manufacturing of both cities. However, in the first important moment, the elaboration of the general ordinances of the Catholic monarchs, this difference was not entirely apparent. This project, as mentioned above, was intended, as mentioned before, was intended to improve and standardize cloth production in the Crown of Castile. In the first attempt in 1494, merchants involved in cloth production in different cities were asked, and the resulting ordinances focused essentially on two aspects: that the cloth to be made should be of high quality and that quality control should be carried out in a centralized place in the city, the Casa de la Veeduría, or House of the Overseers. This house will be formed not only by craftsmen, but also by a merchant. And all these public officers who form the House of the Overseers would be chosen by the municipal council. This new institution was one of the main problems why the new regulation was not implemented. The guilds in many Castilian cities angrily protested that they were losing control of production by not appointing the overseers themselves. And from then on, one of the most debated issues in the following reforms of the project would be whether or not to impose the House of Overseers. The next draft of the ordinances was the one of 1500, and among its architects was a representative of Cuenca called by the Crown and chosen by the city. According to the results of these new ordinances, he must have been a member of one of the main guilds of the city. Not only was the House of the Overseers abolished, but craftsmen were forbidden to carry out more than one occupation in their house, thus limiting the power of those prominent craftsmen who were known as facedores de paños, or cloth makers, and who acted as merchants. The ordinances of 1500 were applied, but they were also protested by cities such as Toledo, whose council appointed the overseers and did not want to lose this prerogative. For all these reasons, a new project was undertaken in 1502, led by 3 craftsmen, one from Toledo, one from Ciudad Real, and one from Segovia. All 3 had in common, as can be seen from an analysis of their backgrounds, that they were the so-called facedores de paños, or cloth makers, and this can also be seen in their proposals to reinstate the House of the Overseers and to accept greater permissiveness when it came to concentrating production in the artisans' houses. Nevertheless, his proposal was again contested by numerous guilds from different towns and was never implemented. In fact, the final project was the one of 1511, made by members of the guilds, and its result was a greater position of strength for the guilds. A position that helped the craftsmen of the city of Toledo to form, firstly, their own guild and defend, after several lawsuits, their right to appoint their own overseers. These ordinances have been analyzed mainly, all these ordinances have been analyzed mainly from the case of Cuenca and Segovia by different authors, and the conclusions tend to focus on a dialectic between minor artisans and cloth makers. The former advocate scattered production within the city, and the later a production concentrated in their workshops, and even projected to the rural area where some tasks were carried out. When we look at the case of Toledo, we can observe a very similar reality insofar as the representative of 1501 corresponds to an outstanding craftsman who seemed to work in different textile professions and also has facilities for dyeing in his own workshop. However, beyond this, the information obtained from diverse documentation shows dynamism that transcend this dialectic relation and reveals a strong territorial integration with the cloth manufacturing. Toledo notarial sources timidly echo some sort of verlag system. In 1508, a contract is documented between two Toledo's merchants with two cloth weavers from Burujon, a village close to the city. These weavers, after receiving a little amount of dyed wool, undertook to deliver coarse cloth to the merchants. There are more examples that are not so explicit, as contracts by which rural agents are obliged to deliver clothes to merchants, although it cannot be documented that wool has been delivered before. There was, therefore, a myriad of localities around the city that concentrated weavers, despite that they weren't big centers with developed cloth manufacturing. The production of these weavers maintained a strong relationship with the city, generally through the intervention of merchants from Toledo. This was not the case when the cloth was brought from farther afield. In the few records preserved of goods entering the city, we can observe the import of clothes from Belmonte, Chillón, Puerto Llano, Ciudad Real, Tendilla, and Cifuentes. In these cases, the documentation itself explained that the cloth was bought and that once brought to the city, it was to be fulled and dyed. There is no direct intervention by the merchants on the cloth weaver, but rather a buying and selling relationship. However, this is not a simple series of cloth purchases, but rather the city actually integrated the production of cloth from other centers in order to full, dye, and then export these clothes. The most illustrative case of this process is scarcely documented. It's clearly documented. In 1500, some merchants from Toledo protested against some of their peers because they had made an agreement with the weavers of Avila to buy from them their entire production of semi-elaborated cloth, some 250,000 ells. Regardless of this monopoly, what is interesting is that those who protested against this monopoly were also from Toledo. In other words, what was produced in Avila was mainly taken to Toledo. As can be seen, Toledo merchants led the cloth production of a wide area, an uncommon situation in cities and towns where guilds had a long tradition. In Cuenca, for instance, local guilds, I remember, were strengthened or fostered. In Cuenca, for instance, all the attempts of introducing semi-elaborated clothes to finish were denounced by local guilds, especially the one of weavers, as Paulino Iradiel showed, documented. After the royal ordinances of 1511, it might be wondered if merchants had the ability to continue coordinating the activities of these different manufacturing centers, because local guilds, I remember, were strengthened and fostered. And this last case happened especially in Toledo. Nevertheless, the statu quo of each city remained unaltered, as it can be seen in the cost production inquiry of 1552. In this year, Royal Council asked to several cities to give a detailed information about production costs and benefits of the finest clothes produced in each city. The reason for this was to find out why there had been a significant increase in cloth prices. Paulino Iradiel studied the source related to Cuenca. Unfortunately, I can present today the ones related to Toledo. These sources make comparison much easier, but before doing any comparison, it is worth paying attention to the remarks of one of the respondents before offering his response. In this case, as you can see, Bartolomé de Zamora points out that costs vary enormously from place to place, and even within the same place, despite the fact that there is a single regulation for the whole kingdom. Among the reasons for these variables are the quality of the wool, the wage of the craftsmen, and the cost of transporting the product to the place of sale. Despite all this, he finally gives some concrete answers that will serve to establish the comparison. Well, firstly, the comparison is between two cities, but between three types of producers. The Toledo merchants who imported clothes from places such as Chillón and Puerto Llano and Almodóvar, and which finished the cloth, the semi-elaborated cloth, and also the Toledo cloth makers and the Cuenca cloth makers. On observing the type of cloth produced in each city by the cloth makers, it can be seen that the production are complementary. They do not make the same type of cloth, although they are similar. Cuenca had finer clothes than Toledo. In Toledo, however, clothes were cheaper. The differentiation is natural, since both productions served many redistribution centers, fundamentally Medina del Campo fairs. However, the production that is generally cheaper is the one of semi-finished products imported to Toledo. The reason seems to lie in the use of coarser wool and the lower labor costs, as is clear from one of the testimonies. This competition is protested by the Toledo cloth makers, who said that they had to reduce their own profits in order to be competitive. Overall, it is important to note that the strength of the mercantile capitals of Toledo not only connects a large territory over which it coordinates production, but also exerts a notable influence on the whole of the cloth factories, since it competes in all genres with prices that can always be better. In conclusion, I hope that you have been able to see how complex and dynamic the manufacture of cloth in Castile between the 15th and 16th centuries was, and that it still needs to be studied in depth. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And now, as always, we have time for questions. I'm looking around. Yeah, there we go.
It's full of legal issues. Thank you so much. I mean, all this story, thank you so much. And I'm wondering about the conflicts, because you said that sometimes the ordinance was not implicated, and there was this conflict between the guilds and the cloth makers and so on. So do we have any idea of non-implication of the law? I mean, what happened? I mean, who ruled?
Well, there was firstly the municipal ordinances, which were ruled by the local authorities. And then we had in 1494 the royal ordinances that were imposed all over the kingdom. The thing is that when we consider the law, over the paper it is really strict, but outside the paper, as any labor law, is the result of the fight between the labor, the workers, and the producer and the merchants. So the ordinances, there was a big fight for fostering and strengthening the guilds in Castile. But whenever it happened or not, when we look at 1552, what we have is that cloth makers are the leaders of the cloth of the cloth manufacturing. The difference I try to show is that while Toledo's merchants or Toledo cloth maker had the ability to go beyond the city, but mainly merchants. Cuenca's cloth maker couldn't. They were more limited by their own, by the local guilds. It was like a new step between this struggle between.
Yes, so my question is that, okay, it's not implicated in praxis, but if we had any decision of the assemblies on such issues, is that even these assemblies do not implicate the law because of the strength of the makers? You understand what I mean?
I haven't understand, sorry, can you repeat?
No, okay.
Assembly.
It says that the cloth makers were very strong, and in practice, many times the ordinances were not implicated because of the strength of the makers. That means that if we had such cases before the assemblies who decided in the end, there are some conflicts, even the assemblies close their eyes before the ordinances and do what the makers want to.
But I need to clarify one thing. Assemblies, you refer to the guild assemblies, to the municipal assemblies?
To the municipal assemblies
Okay.
who act as courts, as courts.
Well, it is a question that was raised yesterday with Marco's presentation, and it depends on the composition of municipal assemblies. While in Cuenca, municipal assembly was composed a little bit, was partly composed by weavers who were part of the guilds. They were less permissive than Toledo, where all were knights who didn't care too much about local manufacturing. They all only wanted to have their rents, and they were like they were opposed to the guilds because they had a right to appoint their own overseas and to collect money for this right, and they lost it in 1511. So Toledo's municipal assembly facilitated the work of the merchants and the cloth makers against guilds and any other association.
You are very clear, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, I've been starting to think about general factors. That is a bit mean maybe because we're now going into economic history in general. But because you mentioned the crown, the guilds, and then cloth merchants, whatever manufacturers, the putting out system Verlag. I think in your case, I just wanted to hear your opinion on to which degree, the crown or the guilds, were then positive or negative factors for economic development in general, in the area. Because, I mean, then again, the English example of the crown imposing high taxes was not too great for some textile industries, then again, not the domestic industry, which actually rose and developed developed positively. Guilds are highly debated for their economic and social purposes, and whether or not they at some point in the 15th, 16th century already or later on outlived their purpose. And I think that some of what you said would point towards the guilds actually not being good for beyond regional economic development. So what do you think?
Well, I think that it's not, how to say it, it's not really definitely or transcendent to Spanish economy, to the point that as it happened in a lesser extent in Portugal, the Spanish manufacturing was not the hegemonic one. You know, there were many imports. So the fights between one and another, it can be compared. Cuenca's cloth manufacturing didn't stop his development for these reasons. But the one who continued being the strongest was Segovia's manufacturing. Cloth manufacturing, because I don't know why, because I haven't studied Segovia as much as I would like to, but the thing is that the center, the comparison between Toledo and Cuenca make things clear in favor of non-guilds thing, but the fact is that Segovia must be included in the analysis, and I would like to do it in the future, in order to see what happened, why in Segovia guilds didn't limitate the local production, but foster it. So I don't have a clear answer about it. I cannot participate in that interesting debate.
Well, you can in that it is not that simple, right? I mean, guilds are just on.
Yeah.
In Portugal, you said also that guilds appear very late, right? Yes. Yeah. Because it depends on the guild, I guess, but it's still because we heard about different production scenarios, right? With the putting out, of course, the Kaufsystem, purchasing system, whatever. It's hard to translate actually. And then the city council being involved in different players, and guilds, of course, were actually quite absent yesterday. Now that I realize that we actually didn't really talk about it that much, because we with woolen production they are present, but still they seem to be also interlinked with the putting out system. And it's interesting the power relations, as you said, like the political power also that they might have, and which direction then production takes. But yeah, there's thoughts in my head. Never mind. My problem.
No, but we tend to. I would like to add that we tend to see guilds usually, and of course today, in the craftsmen, but there were also important guilds in the merchant side that were as opposed to the market, to say in some way, as any other guild. And actually, the whole society conformed some sort of guilds in some way, because municipalities were kind of guilds. But well, it was just a suggestion.
Like a discussion I definitely want to continue throughout our conference. Are there any more questions? Any questions online? Okay, he doesn't see me. I don't think so. I'll just check. Anyone else having a question? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've got one question. I don't know if I missed it during your presentation. One question about the organization of production. So you mentioned on one slide that there was a Verlagssystem, putting out system, yeah. And at the beginning, I had the impression that it was more or less organized like as well as Westphalia or in my examples yesterday. So there was a quality inspection within the cities, and there was this Lord of the Cloth, which I didn't really understand what was his role. And so the people who were coming, for example, from these green places, did they bring their cloth themselves to the city, or who were the putters out, if it was a putting out system or a Verlag system? So can you tell something about the organization?
Of course. The Lord of the Cloth, which has a really good, a nice name.
What's the Castilian?
Señor del Paño. It's the same. I made the translation like the same. The Lord of the Cloth was the one who owned the wool, and the one who took the wool to the weaver, and the one who paid the weaver, and then took the wool and gave it to the craftsman who worked in the fulling machine, and then the one who take it the cloth semi-elaborated to the dyer. He is the Lord of the cloth. So in some way, it's a verlager. I wouldn't say so. It could be, but I wouldn't say so, because all the production is done in the city, and this is the production that wanted the guilds. Like, you go on each of us, you don't control us at all. The cloth makers wanted to put all together in his house, or most of them, or part of them. That's the difference. And the merchants, what they did, it was being Lord of the Cloths, but not just in the city, but also outside, acting like verlagers. And what I could notice in the notarial sources, but with 2-3 contracts, there are no many, is that they give the wool and receive the semi-elaborated cloth, and they are the ones who go outside. And as I pointed out in the green dots, you can see all the places where these lords of the cloth were to deliver the wool and take the cloth. And in the red dots, there is an interesting process, which is interesting because it changed. Usually, Toledo merchants traveled a lot. They were like the first merchants, no, like with the dark food, because they were always on the way, going to the fairs and going to other cities and that. And so they went for the cloth to take back to the city. But at the end of the 15th century, or at the beginning of the 16th century, there were some merchants from these cities of Chillón, Puerto Llano, who went by themselves to the city of Toledo. We don't have many documents about it, but we have one who proves that they took their own clothes and moved to Toledo. But 50 years later, Toledo's merchants were always moving to the city and taking by themselves. So they were like more, how to say, more dynamic or more traveler. That's why I asked you yesterday why your merchants didn't move, because mine were always moving around. I don't know if I answered your question.
The merchants are the pullers out, you can say, in this case.
Yeah. The Lord of the Cloth, which is just a great title. Lord of the Ring, Lord of the Cloth, you know. I'd rather be the latter. Anyway, any more questions from our audience here? Online, I can't see any questions. I think we'll discuss some of those points made just in this discussion a bit further in the rest of our conference this afternoon. But for now, we have a slightly longer lunch break. For those online, of course, not your problem or opportunity. For those here, now, first, thanks again for you and your paper. Yeah, it was great.